Chapter 7. The voyage continued further without incident. Soon, the yellow atmosphere of Ganleth II lay under the two ships, casting a light yellow glow on their hulls. The command staff of the Enterprise waited in the briefing room for Savage. It had been decided that, after the incident with the Klingon carrier, Savage should give some last-minute details on what awaited them on Ganleth. Kirk waited somewhat impatiently, still somewhat hot from Savage's reprimand, but turned his attention to his two engineers sitting before him. Maxwell was actually discussing repairs with Scott, although Kirk could tell by the tones that it was purely business, and that the two hadn't become the best of friends. A quiet laugh drew Kirk's attention to Doctors Danis and McCoy, both seated towards the end of the table. The quiet laughing and look in their eyes did not require any heavy code breaking. The two were definitely not discussing ship's business. Kirk smiled inwardly, and McCoy said that he was too old like hell. Spock and Phelps had been busy discussing various theories as to what the Romulans wanted and the best ways to deal with some of the problems that may arise. This made Phelps all the more promising in Kirk's eyes. He had often said to McCoy that any man that can hold his own in a conversation with Spock deserved some praise. Commander Uhura remained on the bridge along with Weapons Officer Murphy. They were only two bridge officers that could be spared from the meeting. The doors to the meeting room slid open as Savage entered with a hurried stride. Kirk followed his movements to a chair with a slight bit of anger. He didn't think that he would ever fully get over Savage's chewing out. There was some consolation after Savage told Kirk that the reason for diverting the Ravager was to take out the two escort ships that had been with the carrier. Somehow, Kirk felt that Savage still should have attempted to tell them about the carrier. Captain Savage sat down without glancing at Kirk. Gone was the flowing cape and swashbuckler shirt. Instead, Savage wore the black jumpsuit worn by the Starfleet Special Forces. The dagger and pistol were now worn on a wide black leather belt, both weapons within easy reach of his hands. Although Kirk could not see any other weapons on Savage's person, he had the distinct feeling that the dagger and pistol were not the full extent of armament Savage had on him at the moment. The room of people became silent for a few moments until Savage spoke. Barrows Kenton has agreed to talk to us and is waiting for a beam down at his home. How well do the two of you know each other? Savage looked at Kirk, his emotions unreadable. I have never met him personally, but he is well known for being a very stubborn and headstrong man. He will, however, take sound advice if it's the only course of action to take. He is intelligent and shrewd, but above all he is an honest man that will speak his mind. He does not care much for wealth and is concerned more about the good for all rather than just himself. And, Phelps began, how much does he know about you, Captain Savage? Savage turned slightly to answer Phelps' question. As I said before, I imagine that he has heard of me. Most people that do any trading around here have. Exactly what he knows about me depends upon who he has talked to. He smiled slightly and continued. You know how reputations are. To him, I could be anything from a fair trader, an angel of mercy, or the worst pirate to sail the stars. Savage shrugged slightly. But, despite who he has talked to, I do have a reputation in the triangle for honesty, and meaning whatever I say, whether they like it or not. When I informed him that we were here to try and settle this problem with the Romulans, but can make no promises, he accepted that as the truth, and expects no more from us than our best efforts. Kirk nodded, then looked around the table. Are there any special items of interest that we should bring up before we beam down? Maxwell and Scott looked at each other briefly. There are no problems with engineering, Captain. All repairs have been completed, Maxwell informed him. Dr. Danis looked at Kirk and nodded. All injured personnel are stable. I have checked for further radiation poisoning among the crew and found no one else in need of treatment. Kirk nodded in response and glanced at Spock, who shook his head slightly, as did Phelps. Savage, however, had something on his mind. Yes, Captain. I believe that we should discuss the makeup of the landing party and what to do with the Enterprise while we're in orbit. Here it comes, Kirk thought rashly. More lone wolf commentary. And what do you suggest? First, Savage said in a blunt tone, so as not to sound as he was trying to take over the mission, simply giving his advice. We should keep the landing party small, especially the number of security people. Spock raised an eyebrow. Would a small security detail not be advisable in this circumstance? Savage shook his head. No. If the Romulans get here while we are still down there, well, we don't need anyone that may get a little trigger happy. He looked quickly at Kirk. Not that I am suggesting that your personnel are, Captain, but the less armed people we have, the better. Phelps felt a little insulted. These were his people, after all, not Kirk's. My security people are not trigger-happy, Captain Savage. They would only take defensive postures if the situation required it. Savage shook his head and frowned. Commander, I do not doubt the professionalism of your people, but if Captain Kirk and Captain Spock are to be members of the landing party, there could be some tense moments if we meet the Romulans, especially if Commander Sator is one of them. That caught Kirk's ear. And exactly why is that? He asked. There were a few Romulan officers that he had ever met, and as far as he could remember, Sator was not one of them. Savage sat back slightly, a grim frown still on his face. I'm sure you and Captain Spock remember Operation Purloin? Kirk nodded. Yes. That's when we took the Enterprise into Romulan space, under command of IC, to get a cloaking device or at least learn of any improvements on it. That is correct. I am also sure that you remember the Romulan commander that you met and subsequently brought on board. Kirk and Spock both nodded. Her presence on board was strangely pleasant, as Kirk remembered, for her being an enemy commander. What Spock thought was another matter. Kirk remembered that Spock and the commander did not speak to each other, except for polite conversations. He had, however, been witness to the quick shifts of their eyes upon one another when the other was not looking. There had been, or was, far more going on between them than Spock had told him. As it so happens, Savage continued, that commander is the older sister of Commander Sator, and he would very much like to correct the disgrace that her capture brought upon his family clan. In addition, you and Mr. Spock still have a death warrant in the Romulan Empire for sabotage and theft. If we meet up with Sator, I can probably keep him from killing the two of you on sight, but I could do without the extra worry of a security guard doing something provocative. Logical, Spock said, hiding what he knew about the Romulan commander. Spock had never betrayed or spoken about what he and the commander had shared when they were together in her quarters. Even though Savage seemed to know a great deal about what happened, probably more than he let on, Spock's time with the commander was most likely unknown to him. And when dealing with Romulan culture, it was probably best that Commander Sator did not find out either. What do you suggest for a landing party, then? I would suggest, Captain Kirk, that we limit the party to you, Mr. Spock, and myself. He looked at the two doctors. And perhaps Dr. Danis. McCoy took some objection to that. And why not me? He demanded hotly. That's why, Doctor, Savage answered, indicating that was McCoy's response that he was referring to. Unlike Vulcans, Romulans are not devoid of emotion. In fact, some have rather short tempers. They would not tolerate such emotional and derogatory remarks from a human, and just may get riled enough to do something about it. He looked at Kirk. But it is your decision. Captain Sator may respect the doctor's strength of character, or simply laugh at it. The Centaurians, on the other hand, I don't know. Kirk wanted to defuse McCoy quickly, but thought a moment before deciding. "It's all right, Bones. I don't want to break up a winning team." He looked at Lannis. "No insult intended, Dr. Lannis." She smiled. "No insult taken, Captain. I would not deny Dr. McCoy's extensive backgrounds for such missions." "Very well," Savage began. "I believe that should be the limits for our team until we can get better assessed of the situation." "What about the ship?" Phelps asked, as he seemed to be the one to stay aboard as its commander. "For safety's sake, I don't believe that would be wise for the Enterprise to remain out in the open. My ship would be in no danger if a Romulan ship comes in, and it can act as our support ship. If some other trouble comes in, the Ravager can always cloak." "And what should we do with the Enterprise?" Scott asked in a concerned tone. "We cannot make her disappear." Savage smiled slightly. "Ah, but you can, Mr. Scott. All it takes is a little knowledge about planetary magnetic fields. If you correctly park the Enterprise over one of the planet's poles, the magnetic interference will cause any scanners not attuned for it to not read your ship. In effect, the Enterprise will be cloaked to everything but visual scan." "And the chances for the Romulans to use visual scanning are?" McCoy asked. "Oh, very low, Doctor," Savage responded. "The city of White Lass is very near the equator of the planet, and any ship coming into orbit would not normally visually check the poles. Once in standard orbit, they wouldn't be able to see over the horizon anyway." "That will also be our disadvantage," Maxwell added to the conversation. "We won't be able to see them either. The transporter won't be able to lock on your position on the planet, nor," he looked directly at Savage, "will we be in position to provide immediate support for your ship." Savage shook his head. "The Romulans won't bother the Ravager, and if there's any need for help, we can beam up to it. The Ravager can act as a relay for our two ships and call for support if such becomes necessary." "What about the Klingons?" Kirk asked. Savage glanced at him and shrugged in an unconcerned emotion. "If the Ravager is outnumbered, she can cloak and call for help from the Enterprise or from the other Starfleet ships waiting in the wings." He leaned back and smiled broadly. "And if the Klingons show up with a Romulan ship already in orbit, we won't have to do anything but watch the fireworks." The shine of the transporter beam died away as four men now stood on the dry yellow ground of Ganeth II. Kirk found the dry air of Ganeth very similar to that of Iowa. The vast fields of green grain only further accentuated the feeling, along with the slight grassy smell that the wind carried to him. He glanced at McCoy, who also seemed to be enjoying the view, now that his eyes had adjusted to the increased light. McCoy had always complained, among other things, about the effect of beaming off an artificially lit ship, with luminance being less than standard sunlight, and to a usually brighter planet's surface. Such occurrences left him light-blinded for a few seconds. This was mostly an inconvenience, but McCoy had always wondered what the unhappy results would be if an immediate action were required after coalescing. Spock was, as usual, too busy with his tricorder to take in the view. Yet to Kirk he seemed ill at ease since the beam down for some reason. Kirk glanced at Savage as he stood like a man unimpressed with the sights before him. Yet with the wind blowing his slightly longer hair, he seemed to fit the environment like a returning conqueror. "This is their main export?" Kirk asked, still looking at the vast fields of plants. Savage nodded. "Yes, it's called Lee. The population use it to make a type of bread called agro." He frowned somewhat. "It's always tasted somewhat moldy to me. They also make a type of alcoholic beverage. By fermenting the grain, it is called fralasia. What I tend to call it is something else." Savage looked over at Spock. "I would not recommend that you drink any, Captain Spock. Some of the additives tend to have a disagreeable effect on those of the copper blood persuasion." McCoy stifled a laugh. "Figures. he grumped, causing a look from Spock. The four turned to the sound of a wooden door creaking open. So far they had been taking in the scenery and had yet to knock on the door. Hal Ralter walked out of the door and towards the men with an extended hand. "Greetings, gentlemen," he said as he shook Kirk's hand. "I am Hal Ralter, Agricultural Director for this region and the city of Whiteless," continued to shake the hand of McCoy. Spock refrained from offering his hand, saying nothing to Ralter about Vulcans not wanting to have physical contact with others, if possible. Ralter did not seem to mind, but stopped when he extended a hand to Savage, receiving a stony look in return that made Spock's unemotional face seem like it was smiling. "Greetings, Director Walter," Kirk replied in a formal tone, ignoring Savage's lack of diplomacy. "I am James Kirk, acting captain of the Federation Starship Enterprise. This is Mr. Spock, my science officer and second in command, Dr. McCoy, and as a neutral party," he motioned toward Savage, "Captain Savage of the trade ship Ravager." Ralter nodded to the officers as he was introduced to them, all except Savage. The man looked at the bearded face grimly. "So you are the famous Captain Savage. I have heard much about you, some good, most not." Savage smiled grimly. "I don't doubt it." Ralter turned away from Savage's look, somewhat taken aback by his response. He motioned to the house. "If you will follow me, Barros is waiting." They followed him into the white stucco house, which was amazingly cool considering the outside temperature. The inside of the house was simple in design, but functional. Large wooden beams held up the ceiling and supported the walls. The furniture was similarly made of dark brown wood, but so well made that Kirk expected them to be as solid, if not more so, than any comparable metal or plastisteel chair. A large stone fireplace adorned one side of the room that they were in. Above it, a large mantel of dark wood which sat various objects. One in particular caught Kirk's eye immediately. One of the objects presented a bright yellow glint of reflected sunlight. Kirk thought it may have been some mirror or polished metal, but as he changed position, he could tell that it was some type of a yellow crystal, some 6 inches in height, standing erect in a display holder. "You are from the Federation?" a deep voice asked from the kitchen off to the side. Kirk turned to see that the speaker was a man in his late 40s or 50s. His gray hair was shoulder length and looked somewhat tangled or windblown. Dressed in a loose white shirt and brown pants, Barros Kenton walked with the authority that would not have been normally given or thought of to a man of his appearance. "Yes, sir," Kirk answered. "I am James Kirk of the Starship Enterprise. My officers, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy. This is Captain Savage, who will be acting as a neutral party." "Yes," Kenton nodded. "We have talked." He looked carefully at Savage, his gaze stopping momentarily at the holstered pistol. "I have heard of you, many things in fact. But I'll speak of your honor, and of speaking the truth in all things. You are known to be a man of your word, and that is good enough for me." Savage gave a slight bow. "I am here to try to make a peaceful and beneficial agreement between you and the Romulan Empire. Captain Kirk represents the Federation. I just represent myself as one of the independent traders that might be affected by any outcome here." Kenton nodded at the explanation. "Very well, then." He sat down in an overstuffed chair, after motioning for the others to sit. "I suppose I should start by telling you why we need help." Kirk nodded in agreement. "We know only that the Romulans want something from you, and are prepared to use force to get it." "Yes," Kenton agreed. "That is the basic problem." "Just what exactly do they want, sir?" Kenton looked at Spock for a moment, then nodded at Ralter. Ralter walked over to the mantel to obtain a crystal that had caught Kirk's interest. He walked over to Spock and handed it to him. Ralter watched the Vulcan study the faceted crystal, as he informed all the men about the artifact. "That is a naturally occurring crystal that we call acarite. It was once a very common mineral, but can now only be found in a single cavern in the nearby mountains. Spock took in Walter's commentary as he turned the crystal over in his hand. He produced his tricorder and began to scan the amber-colored crystal. Triclinic arrangement composed of quartz, gallium, cadmium, lithium, copper, and sulfur with, Spock lifted an eyebrow, traces of dilithium. A very unique combination of minerals. Sounds like it could be highly conductive, Savage commented as he glanced at the yellow mineral. Spock glanced at Savage with some surprise in his eyes to Savage's knowledge of mineralogy, but it was Kenton that affirmed the theory. Yes, Captain Savage, it is highly conductive, and when polished like that one, it has a unique optical qualities for capturing and focusing light. He continued. You see, my planet was once heavily dependent on fossil fuels as a power source for a largely mechanized culture. Although we have radioactive minerals and the knowledge to use them as a power source, we could not devise an economical method for doing so. Walter picked up the discussion. The heavy use of fossil fuels was beginning to affect our environment, even with the use of various methods to control emissions. We had to find some alternative fuel source, but could find none that would satisfy our requirements. But we saw solar panels towards the city, McCoy spoke out, remembering the glints of sunlight from the city that stood in the horizon. Spock had informed him as to what the bright flashes meant. Yes, you did, Doctor, Kenton answered with a nod. At that time, our solar technology was not cost efficient, and would take up far too much room. That is when the acarite was discovered to have its unique properties that lend itself to our needs. It had been widely used as inexpensive jewelry until its hidden qualities were accidentally discovered, Walter added quickly. Savage cut in. It was found that not only could the crystal focus the sun's light more efficiently for your solar cells, but could also be used as a conducting medium to carry the electrical power. Kenton nodded at Savage. Very good, Captain. Yes. By using the crystal's optical and conductive properties, we have increased the power output of the solar systems while decreasing the wasted energy. Overall, the crystals allowed for an average power efficiency of some 400% from the previous system. With such an increase in solar efficiency, our use of fossil fuels dropped so drastically that we actually stopped using them within a few years, Walter said. This was, of course, a very long time ago. The environmental damage began to repair itself, and our culture has prospered ever since. But, Kenton continued the dialogue, the crystals were not as plentiful nor as perfect as they were originally thought of. After some 40 years of extensive mining, the supplies began to run out. He pointed at the crystal. Acarite has the ability to form new crystals of fairly large size within a year in the caverns that they were found. The extreme concentration of minerals from the volcanic gases in those places was apparently responsible for the rapid formation. But for the crystals to be useful, they must be of a certain size and have no flaws, Walter explained. At first, the growing process could form large crystals rapidly, as only those large enough for immediate use were being mined. But as the mining continued unhampered, the crystals did not have time needed to form large formations, and eventually crystal growth halted completely as the mining disturbed the atmosphere of the caverns. So your people actually depleted your sources. Yes, Captain Kirk, Kenton replied. True that there were enough crystals for our purposes, but the constant use caused them to fracture in time, destroying their usefulness. That began to happen a little over 200 years ago, and none of the original crystals can now be used. And the Romulans want these fractured crystals? McCoy asked Kenton. I thought you just said they were useless. Kenton quickly shook his head. No, Doctor. They want the only remaining crystals still available on the entire planet. He motioned to the mountain range outside the windows. My third father discovered a cavern full of acarite in the mountains. Being a true conservationist, he told no one of his discovery. Your third father? McCoy asked. The father of my father's father, Kenton replied to McCoy. My father is called my first father. His father is my second father, and his my third. It was he that discovered the last of the acarite. He studied the formation and growth patterns secretly for years. From his studies, he learned that the growth of crystals to the optimum size took 2 seasons. Further, he found a way to remove the top portion of the crystal and leave a growth base for the new formation of a crystal. By carefully controlling the harvest, my family has been able to supply acarite to the population. Since our people began using the crystals in the most efficient manner possible, Walter nodded, Barrows has been able to supply enough to meet the minimum requirements for the needs of the planet. He then added, a few go without full power, or enough to meet all users, but we are very reluctant to go back to fossil fuels. What the Romulans want, Kenton informed them, is to mine all of the crystals in the cavern. Normally, at the proper time, we could allow this, as they have offered a substantial payment. Walter nodded in agreement. But the crystals are in their growth or seeding phase. To disturb that now would be devastating. Such activities would result in the lack of any further crystal growth and cause our planet to go back to the use of fossil fuels. Savage had asked Spock for a yellow crystal and was studying it intensely as he listened. And even if the Federation were to offer you an alternative power source, even one solar-based, it would take time to set it up and longer for your people to learn how to operate it. Kenton nodded. And there is no time to do that. The Lee will be harvested soon, and it takes nearly 3 weeks just to harvest the fields in the northern regions. And that's with all the help that we can get. Kirk nodded in understanding. He had participated in a few such harvests himself. Is there any way we can see the cavern? There may be some way to defend it, or possibly hide it from the Romulans. If you wish, Kenton said as he stood up, we can take my flyer and be there within a few minutes. But why would the Romulans want the crystals for? They certainly have no need for anything used for solar power. They use fusion reactors for the most part as power sources on the world. Savage slowly stood up, still turning the crystal over in his hand, as well as in his head. Mr. Kenton, would you mind if I sent this crystal up to my ship to be examined? Kenton gave a nod. Not at all, but that crystal has a hairline fracture in it. It's useless until it's cut into smaller crystals. Thank you, Savage replied, then spoke to the empty air before him. Shaki, prepare to beam up a small mineral sample from my position, and have Carl look at it from the sea system point of view. I need the results yesterday. The other men in the room looked at Savage as though he had gone insane, but were surprised to see the crystal vanish in a transporter beam after Savage had laid it on the floor. Spock looked at Captain Savage with a raised eyebrow and curiosity. Subcutaneous communicator? Savage nodded as if he expected everyone to know about them. He looked as if he were about to make a comment about it, but turned his head slightly as if trying to hear a faint sound to his right side. There's a Romulan ship that has just entered sensor range, he told them. Who is it? He asked the air. Kirk looked at Spock, then at Kenton with a somewhat grim glance, as Savage continued to inform them of his data. He nodded when he received the information. It's the Aelia, Commander Sator's ship. ETA for orbit is 72 minutes. That's odd. Commander Sator said nothing about returning this early, Kenton said. He wasn't due for another 3 days to get our final decision. Savage shook his head slightly. It appears that your decision is going to be due slightly earlier than that. I believe that we should go see this cavern while we can. Kenton nodded. This way. In moments, the wedge-shaped craft was soaring above the green fields and nearing the mountains. Kirk was enjoying the flight as he looked at the sea of green below him. It had been a long time since he had seen such fields firsthand, and he had decided to definitely enjoy the moment. McCoy and Spock were also looking out the windows at the passing scenery. Spock seemed more interested than McCoy, probably due to the scantness of such vegetation on Vulcan. Savage had sat in the rear of the flyer, and remained silent and withdrawn since they had left, not even bothering to look out the window near him. Kenton brought the flyer down on its lifters to land on a large rock nestled between two peaks. The men exited the vehicle and looked around the rocky area. Plenty of yellow sand, loose gravel, and rock, but there was no overt cavern entrance anywhere to be seen. The surroundings appeared simply as solid rock or rubble from past rock slides. Kenton motioned for them to walk around one of the outcroppings of rock that lay a few meters away. "This way, gentlemen," he said, as he led the way around a large outcropping. As they rounded the large boulder, the men could see a dark fissure in the rock face, barely big enough to walk through. As they neared the fissure, Spock began to shift around slightly, a motion that both Kirk and McCoy recognized as discomfort. "What is it, Spock?" Kirk asked with concern. He had never seen Spock act so uncomfortably without there being a major and obvious problem. Spock immediately straightened himself up and stood rigidly, forcing himself to take a normal posture, not realizing that his agitation was so evident. "There is a higher concentration of sulfur dioxide in this area," he answered, simply as though such a response should suffice. "Yes, it's coming from the cavern," Kenton informed Spock. "However, it is not a dangerous concentration yet." Kirk sniffed the air and could just barely detect a rotten egg smell of sulfur. He had wondered why Spock referred to the amounts as high, then realized that being born on a planet with a thin atmosphere, the Vulcans were probably very sensitive to odors, more so than humans. Yet, Vulcan had volcanoes and hot sulfur springs. Kirk wondered why Spock would seem to find the odor that he himself could barely smell as being objectionable. It was also odd in that Kirk had never known Spock to make any references to odors in such a way. Perhaps some other gas was causing the discomfort. Without further embellishments concerning the odors of sulfur, the five squeezed through the crack to enter a larger opening that formed a cavern. The entire area was lit with various shades of intensities of yellow, gold, and light brown. Kirk looked at the walls and realized that the interior was completely covered in small acarite crystals, and that the lighting effect was caused by the reflection and refraction of the light coming through the fissure. The cavern was so laden with crystals that the men could only think that the cavern had been carved from them. It was as though some geologist had become architecturally stimulated and purposely grown a crystal grotto. Crystal stalactites, larger than a man, dropped from the roof of the cavern. In some places they met and joined a stalagmite companion. Amber crystals as large as Kirk's leg jutted up from the floor. This is as far as we dare go," Kenton told them, as he shifted to the side so that the others could get a full view of the crystal-laden cavern. "Any further, and we may disturb the atmosphere of the cavern and disrupt the crystal growth." Kirk could now clearly smell some of the sulfur, and glanced at Spock, who was now showing more overt signs of displeasure. He looked down the cavern and saw that the walls narrowed some 50 meters down, but still continued on, the light getting dimmer, but no less colorful. "How far does the cavern extend?" Savage asked. "Another 350 meters beyond the narrowing," Kenton answered. "However, there are several side tunnels and pockets. Toward the end of the main cavern is the volcanic vent that the gases come from. The sulfur dioxide becomes so highly concentrated that miners must wear self-contained environmental suits." "I would theorize," Spock commented in a somewhat choked voice, "that such concentration of sulfur dioxide in the presence of any volcanic steam would actually result in a sulfuric acid vapor. Kenton nodded that the Vulcan scientist was correct. He added further, a miner's suit will last, about a day or so, depending on how close he ventures to the vent. Even with frequent washing, the acids eventually eat through the suit and breathing equipment. What about the vent itself? Kirk asked, having never been much of a geology buff. The Ganathian nodded again as he spoke. The vent is nearly 3 meters across and goes straight down for an unknown length. We have dropped miners over to cover 500 meters, but the crystals lining the vent are so small and sharp that they cut the ropes that we use to lower the men down. We haven't wanted to use any type of metal tethers, polycorded or not, for fear of contamination of the gases with the metal oxides. How far in do you begin the mining? McCoy asked as he stared at the large amber crystals. Kenton pointed to one of the nearby outcroppings, 5 meters in front of them. We usually begin work there and work down until we reach about 10 meters from the vent opening. Any closer and the crystals get smaller until they become too small to use. Although the volcanic discharges vary and a crystal yields slightly per year, we average some 4 metric tons of crystals per harvest. Kirk studied the crystal-studded walls at that. He was no mining expert, but he could just not see 4 tons of the yellow mineral before him. Savage had walked over to one of the large crystal formations, studying the facets. Do the Romulans know where this is? Kenton turned to watch Savage caress the crystal's large facet that faced him. No, he responded. At least not its exact position. It wouldn't take long for them to find it, Savage said as he continued to stroke the crystal facets absent-mindedly. They know that it is an area located near your home and in the mountains. They would also know that there must be an area large enough to land a flyer or two, since the terrain is too steep to climb and carry crystals. All they need do is search for such places. Spock nodded. Logical. They would then simply have to transport down and search those areas for any type of subterranean entrance. That would probably be unnecessary, Mr. Spock. Savage shook his head slightly. Most likely they would not need to waste their time. Savage looked at the group. They would simply have to scan the area for increases in atmospheric sulfur dioxide. Such increased concentrations of the gas would indicate a volcanic vent nearby and being the source of the crystals. Maybe we could cover the entrance temporarily, McCoy suggested. Prevent any of the gases from escaping out into the open. That may help, Savage said, assuming that Sator will waste time searching for the entrance instead of forcing someone to tell him its location. Kirk frowned at the idea of Romulan interrogation on one of these simple farmers. Suggestions? Savage shook his head. It would not be difficult to hide the entrance. I could have my ship transport a large boulder up against a fissure. He directed his gaze at Kenton. But that could bring some unnecessary force upon your people when Sator finds out what was done, and that you no longer have access to the cavern. It is illogical to assume that such an act would stop the Romulans from finding the cavern anyway. Were they to force someone to tell them of the cavern's location, or they found it on scanners, they could simply reverse the feat that you would have us do and beam them out the boulder. As I look at it, Kirk started, you have 2 choices, Mr. Kenton. Either you let the Romulans have what they want, or you destroy the cavern. Kenton shook his head. Both would spell doom for my planet. Surely there must be a third choice. He paused for a moment in thought. We could fight them. Kirk responded by shaking his head. That is an option that I cannot give you at this time. Besides, such action may be far worse for your planet. Kenton turned to look at Savage. And do you have any suggestions, Captain Savage? Not at the moment. I could talk to Sator and try to convince him to leave, but any success depends upon what they want the crystals for to start with. To be honest, with the indications you have given us, and what we know about the Romulan fleet buildup, I would say that such is extremely doubtful. He nodded towards Kirk. And I agree with Captain Kirk about the damage possible if you try to fight the Romulans. They could beam down an assault force and reduce Whitelist to rubble. They wouldn't even have to do that. They can destroy the city from orbit. He took a deep breath and looked down the cavern, as though remembering a time when he was witness to such a tragedy. "Then there's nothing you can do?" Kenton asked, nearly pleading. Savage turned to look at Kirk, then back at Kenton with a head shake. "There doesn't appear to be. And that's just when the Romulans come back. If the Klingons show up as well, I hesitate to think about the trouble that you're looking at." "The Klingons?" Kenton exclaimed, with a hint of terror on his voice. "Why would they come here?" "They know that the Romulans are interested in something, so they want to find out what it is as well." Kenton was visibly disturbed by what Kirk had just said, and began to slowly walk out of the cavern, muttering out loud to himself, "The Klingons, they will destroy us." "Not necessarily," Spock replied as the four followed Kenton back through the fissure. "It is more likely that the Klingons find nothing of interest here. They will leave without wasting any effort toward destructive ends." Savage nodded in agreement. "That would be a standard Klingon policy. If they find out about the Acolyte, though, they may decide to destroy your people and take what they want without warning. Although it would be more likely that if they do not find a use for the crystals themselves, they will simply destroy the cavern to keep the Romulans from getting their hands on it." Savage stopped Kenton with a hand on the shoulder. "You may end up deciding against the lesser of two evils, Mr. Kenton. The Romulans at least made an offer. The Klingons won't." Kenton opened the door to his flyer in silence. He stood there with one arm on the open door, shaking his head to clear away his thoughts. "That decision will have to be made by the Council. I will call a meeting at once when we return." He looked back at the four men who stood waiting. "I would like to have you four there to share your knowledge and ideas." Kirk nodded firmly. "Of course. Anything that we can do." Kirk, Spock, and McCoy climbed into the vehicle. The Savage stopped at the door to look at Kenton. "You had better tell your council that they won't have long to decide. Remember, Commander Sator is on his way." Kenton nodded at Savage as he climbed inside. The aircraft took off and headed directly for the towers of Whitelist. The city quickly came into view as the flyer neared. The spires that were the small lines from Kenton's home now loomed up as great white pillars, trying their best to touch the sky. Sunlight glinted off the multiple solar panels that covered almost all of the building roofs in the city. All of the buildings were constructed of a white clay that resembled stucco in appearance. At first sight, the group had thought that the city roads were solid paved stone, but as they neared, they could see that the yellow roads were of a cobblestone construction from large rock slabs. The rocks were the same color and texture of nearby mountains, which was probably the source of their material. Along various streets, the group could see the mixture of technology. Carts of various goods were either being pulled by a large, shaggy-looking horse or by some type of electrical motorized vehicle. People walked along one of the streets in large numbers, and Kirk could see the carts lined both sides. He motioned for McCoy to look. "Some type of market," McCoy responded. "Seems like a very relaxed city." "It is, Dr. McCoy," Kenton said as he flew in an arc around one of the towers and began to land in front of a large building in the center of the city. Spock examined the tower structure as the craft lowered to street level. He could see that although the architects had designed the tower for aesthetics, there was also a functional reason for the towers. "Evaporation cooling towers." Kenton nodded. "Yes, Mr. Spock. Not only does it keep the buildings cool, but it also uses no power in order to function." The craft settled down in front of two large wooden doors. Kenton motioned for the men to follow as he walked up the small flight of stairs. Upon opening the doors, a cool breeze hit the 5 men, a much welcome change for them. The 5 walked into a large room, as simple in furnishing design as Kenton's home had been. Kenton walked over to the corner of the room to search for a rope that hung down from the center of one of the cooling towers. After a few pulls, the ringing sound of bells echoed downward. Kenton eventually walked back to join the men. The council should be coming within moments. Please be seated, and I will get some refreshments as we wait. Kirk nodded politely. He and the others began to walk to some of the chairs set in front of the large wooden slab that was apparently the council chamber. The 4 sat down in the wood chairs as Kenton returned with 5 glasses on the wooden tray, each filled with an opaque green liquid. He offered each man a glass, who accepted it with a polite nod. Kenton returned a smile as he took his own glass and set the tray down. This is our finest drink, Fralasia. Savage stood up and placed his glass on the tray untouched. Excuse me, gentlemen. I have a call from the Ravager, and since you seem unnerved to me talking to the air, I'll just go over to the corner. He bowed slightly as he left. Kirk nodded as he watched Savage walk away, and then back at the drink in his hand. Coward, he thought with amusement. Kirk tentatively sniffed the opaque green liquid in the glass and twitched his nose slightly to the scent. It smelled like a cross between mold and freshly cut grass. Kirk looked at the others from the corner of his eyes. Spock had not even lifted the glass, holding it upon his leg and trying to ignore the fact that it was even in his grasp. McCoy, on the other hand, was swirling the liquid slightly, as if to see if there was any sediment at the bottom. Despite McCoy's seeming interest in his own drink, he was more intent in watching what Kirk was going to do. McCoy saw that Kenton was already refilling his own glass, and took the opportunity to lean over and whisper to Kirk, "You're the captain, Jim. Bottoms up." Kirk wanted so much to pour his glass on McCoy's head at that instant. He frowned instead and drained his glass without a pause. Kirk had hoped that the worst the drink would be was like the beer that he had on 20th Century Earth with Gillian. The aroma of the Fralasia was bad enough. The flavor was, to Kirk's surprise, distinctly worse. It tasted like moldy bread or algae-filled water. He may have tasted something worse at one time in his life, but at the moment he couldn't think of what. He was preparing to make the normal facial gesture that accompanied the gagging reflex, but stopped when he saw McCoy's interested gaze. Just as the aftertaste hit him, forcing Kirk to counter the regurgitation reflex, he smiled at McCoy and smirked, as he usually did when an unknown substance turned out to be relishing after all. McCoy looked at Kirk suspiciously, but took a gulp when he saw that Kirk was going to try to get the last few drops from his glass. The moment the first few ounces hit his taste buds, McCoy almost spewed out a swallowful, nearly spilling his glass in the process. Kenton turned to McCoy with genuine concern on his face. "Something wrong, Doctor?" he asked worriedly as McCoy choked slightly, fighting back tears of total disgust. McCoy waved his hand in a dismissing gesture. "Not at all," he sputtered. "It's just that this is a little, strong for me. Mr. Spock and I usually don't drink alcoholic beverages this strong." He made a quick glance in Spock's direction. "Right, Spock?" Spock nodded. "That is true, Doctor. We do not." Which was the truth and a manner of speaking. Although McCoy did drink on occasion, very rarely did both of them drink anything like that together. McCoy smiled slightly to himself and motioned to Kirk with his thumb. "Though the captain here loves a good drink such as this." The doctor's eyes twinkled their blue lasers of mischievousness. "Don't you, Jim?" Kirk was caught, but decided not to let it show. "Indeed I do, Doctor," he replied as he held an empty glass out for Kenton to refill. "Although this is a little more herbal than I am used to, it has a delicious flavor." Kenton smiled proudly at the compliment as he filled Kirk's glass. "I'm happy that you enjoy it, Captain Kirk. Few outsiders like it." Kirk lifted his glass as a salute to Kenton, then took a deep sip, hoping that it would stay down, and giving the best straight face that he could manage. McCoy and Spock looked at him incredulously, while Kenton gleamed with some pleasure. The sound of the wooden doors opening behind them drew their attention away, however. It did give Kirk a chance to tell McCoy that he would get his revenge in time. At first, only 3 men took their seats at the long table, but within minutes all 11 council members had seated themselves silently in front of Kirk and crew. Savage returned to his chair beside Kirk shortly before the last council member sat down. He leaned over to Kirk with a hint of a grin. "How's the water?" Kirk grimaced. "Very flavorful." Savage smiled and chuckled slightly. "You should buy yourself one of those automatic beeping communicators for just such occasions. I know where I can pick one up for you if you like." Kirk shook his head slightly with a smile, his eyes motioning towards McCoy. It was worth it to see McCoy's face when he took a swallow. "It's my payback for drinking all of those mint juleps of his." McCoy heard his name mentioned and leaned over slightly. "What was that, Jim?" Kirk gave McCoy an innocent face. "I didn't say anything, Bones." McCoy stared at him for a moment, then sat back up and looked at Spock with questioning eyes. Spock maintained his stone face, acting as though he had heard nothing of the conversation. In truth, he had heard every word, and was himself somewhat pleased to see McCoy's reaction at the event. "Fellow council members," Kenton began, "I have called you here to introduce you to these men." He motioned to Kirk. "This is Captain James Kirk and his officers, Spock and McCoy of the Federation. With them is Captain J.F. Savage, acting as a neutral party." Brief greetings were exchanged, Savage getting mostly concerned looks from the assemblage. Kenton continued, "I have also called you here because Captain Savage has informed me that the Romulan commander, Sator, is on his way here, and will be in orbit in," he looked at Savage, "37 minutes, Savage answered bluntly. That didn't seem right. They hadn't been out that long, Kirk thought. Kenton was thinking the same. "I had thought that according to your ship we had much more time than that." Savage stood up and nodded grimly. "We did have. The Aelia has increased speed for Ganeth." Kenton continued to look at Savage, expecting more information, but after receiving none, he continued to speak to his fellow council members. "So, in 37 minutes, we will need to have a final answer to the Romulan demands." One of the council members looked at Kirk. "What is your advice, Captain Kirk?" Kirk stood up to address the members, a slight look of grim helplessness on his face. "As of yet, Starfleet has not given me the authority to attack the Romulans, except in defense of my ship and crew. We can, however, supply you with non-military aid and materials." The starship captain breathed out deeply, seeing the concern building in the faces before him. "I am sorry for not being able to do more at this time. As for my recommendation," he frowned, "you have 2 choices. Either you give the Romulans what they want, or destroy the Acherite cavern to prevent the Romulans from getting it by force." The 11 men bantered among until one of the others broke off his discussion and looked at Kirk. "We could fight them if you supplied us with weapons." Kirk shook his head. "I'm sorry, but that is not an option for me. Federation laws prevent me from doing so." "It wouldn't do you any good," Savage replied loudly as the group became hushed. "If Captain Kirk gave you 1,000 phasers, the Romulans would simply use orbital bombardment and blow you away without letting you even see their faces. Unless you have several space vehicles that are capable of battle, you wouldn't stand a chance." The same member that brought up the subject turned slightly red at Savage's response. "Death does not frighten us, Captain. We are not cowards to hide in our homes when the Romulans come." Savage shook his head once. It was not my intention to imply that you were, Councilman. However, your speech would make a good epitaph for your city, if anyone was ready to read it. That caused a brief murmur among the men. I have seen what the Romulans are capable of. You have but three choices, Savage continued, as the room fell silent once more. You can give the Romulans what they want. Let them take the Acolyte by force, or destroy the Acolyte yourselves. And if we destroy the crystals, what will happen to our world? Our technology would be lost, and our environment would once again be endangered. Savage looked at the other member that had just spoken with a deadly serious stare. Would you rather lose your technology or your population? He gazed at the entire table. You had best consider well what your strength is equal to, and what exceeds your abilities. Kirk quickly added, however, the Federation could supply new power generators, so you do not need to depend on the crystals. It would simply take time to bring them here, install, and train your people to use it. The council began to converse again as Savage sat down. Spock leaned over and began a quiet conversation with Savage. After a few moments of discussion, Spock stood up to address the council. There may be a fourth option, gentlemen, the Vulcan said calmly. The members stopped talking and gave Spock their attention as he continued. You could possibly use some of the crystals from Mr. Kenton's source and reseed some of the other caverns in the area to make them productive once again. Kenton shook his head to show futility. That was attempted many times years ago. The results were totally wasted. Not only does the formation of the correct lattice structure depend upon the seed crystal, but also the concentration of volcanic gases, its exact competition to the percentage of minerals, and the orientation of the crystals to the magnetic lines of Ganeth. If these factors are not perfectly matched, the crystals form an aggregate of small crystals that is completely useless. All endeavors to match the necessary conditions have failed. Another member added, besides, most of the old mines have been destroyed by attempts to find more crystal deposits. Good thought, though, Kirk whispered to Savage and Spock. He looked at the council. It appears, then, that your options are limited to what we have given you. Several of the members nodded in agreement. Kenton then looked at Kirk. If you gentlemen will excuse us, we would like to discuss this situation privately. The group stood and bowed slightly. As you wish. We will step outside and await your decision, Kirk said. The four walked towards the doors, but paused as Kenton called after them. Thank you for your advice, gentlemen. Kirk turned and nodded again. The four continued, stepping out into the heat and the bright light of the outside. Savage shook his head and gestured outward. Better get a good look at the city while it's in one piece. McCoy looked at Savage. You think they'll try to oppose the Romulans? Savage nodded an affirmative response before he looked at Kirk. You had better call for any backup that you've got before it's too late. If they decide to say no to Commander Sator, he gestured behind him, then the Romulans will reduce the city to ash. And, he added with a shake of his head, if the Klingons get here and find out what's going on, they'll blow the planet out from under the Romulans. Kirk looked at Savage for a moment. He seemed to know more about the situation than he was letting on. You know what the Romulans want with the Acolyte, don't you? I have a pretty good notion, but would rather not say more without some facts. When Sator arrives, I'll get him to confirm my suspicions. Still, there's something else here that we're missing. Even if what I suspect is true, it's not enough for the Romulans to do this. Kirk frowned. Savage was pulling one of Spock's traits that always irritated him, not guessing or giving up a theory without facts. This Commander Sator just won't give you the answers to all of this, will he? Savage kicked at a small dull yellow stone. Well, Captain, it's not that he'll just come out and say so, but many times, and with a few facts, the truth has a way of coming to light, by what is not said than by what is. 20 minutes passed until the doors opened again and the council members began to walk out, each with a stern look of decision on their faces. Kenton brought up the rear with a grim face. Kirk and the others began to walk slowly towards the steps to meet him. "We have decided to fight them," Kenton said in a low tone. "The city will be evacuated until this is all over with." He looked at Savage and gave a nod. "I would also request that you cover the cavern entrance as you suggested earlier." Savage responded back with a nod of compliance. "What will you fight with?" Kenton began to slowly walk toward his flyer as he spoke. "We have only primitive weapons, at least compared to what you have, and few of them." "You know that you can't win a fight against the Romulans or the Klingons," McCoy said. "What do you hope to accomplish?" Kenton spun around rapidly, making McCoy take a quick step backward. "This is our world, Doctor. True, we may die here, but what are the lives of a few men compared to that of an entire population?" He looked at Kirk. "As a starship captain, you must realize what we are doing and why." Kirk agreed. "I understand all too well about sacrifice for the greater good, but you should consider that sacrifice only if it will succeed in saving what it is you're fighting for. There is no guarantee that by fighting you can keep them from getting the crystals. But there's no guarantee that we can't. A slim chance is better than no chance." Savage laughed once with bitterness. Shaking his head in disbelief, he spoke. "Mr. Kenton, do you truly understand what you will be facing? What kind of weapons the Romulans have?" "I am aware that their weapons are superior to ours," he responded sternly, slightly angered at Savage's tone. "But we have some brave men that are crack shots. As we have been trying to tell you, the Romulans or the Klingons don't have to come down here to destroy you." Savage paused for a moment. "Perhaps it's time that you see what I mean firsthand. At least you may be able to protect yourselves better when you see what you're up against." Kenton eyed Savage carefully before he responded. "What do you suggest? We don't have much time." "It's time you will just have to make, and it won't take long to prove my point," Savage admitted. "Is there some building or structure nearby that is abandoned and out of the way?" "There is an old grain silo on the outskirts of town that is no longer used. It is nearly collapsed." Savage nodded with a grim smile. "That will do. If you are not needed here, I suggest that you take us there for my demonstration." Kenton nodded hesitantly. "If you consider it that important, I'll have some of the men meet us there too." Savage nodded as Kenton motioned for the group to get inside his flyer. Kirk grabbed Savage by the arm, drawing a quick look that told him to let go, but Kirk continued to meet Savage's look. "Just what are you planning to do?" "We may as well let them look death in the face, Captain. They may just change their minds about fighting. And if not, well, they will know what they're up against." Kirk tilted his head slightly. "What you're planning may violate the Neutral Zone Treaty." Savage smiled as he sat down in the now familiar flyer bucket seat. "It doesn't. They are willing to see the display, and already know about the technology, or so they think. Nor am I attempting to sell or give them the technology or the weapons." He looked out the window as the flyer rose above the city spires, and spoke quietly to himself. At least, not yet. It was a short flight to the silo, filled with some jerking maneuvers as Kenton dodged the many other vehicles that were busy carrying evacuees. The flyer landed some 500 meters away from the large silo, as per Savage's advice. Only 20 meters away from where they landed were the remains of a broken-down farm machine resembling a tractor. Several other vehicles began to land close by. The new arrivals all carried rifles or pistols that, Kenton explained, used a chemical explosive to fire a metal projectile. Along with the weapon, the men carried a smug look of defiance. Savage frowned inwardly. That look would fade soon enough. Gathering the men, Savage first walked up to the farm machine and examined it closely. He then stepped back 5 meters and motioned for the group of men to step back with him. He withdrew his heavy pistol and held it above his head for all to see. This hand weapon of mine is just a pistol, and has about the same destructive force as a Klingon or Romulan disruptor pistol. Their military rifles have nearly triple the power. He brought the pistol down level to the farm machine. Savage carefully aimed at the engine block of the machine and fired. The pistol jolted in the man's grip as a bolt of white energy issued forth to slam into the cold metal. The engine block exploded in the super-hot slag as the plasma struck it. The force of the blast caused the entire front end of the tractor to explode outward, casting dust into the air. The crowd gasped in shock, and some bent down in fear. The yellow dust soon cleared to reveal only the rear end of the vehicle to be in one piece. The rest had been reduced to slag and spread over a 3-meter area behind where it had originally been. Savage holstered the weapon, satisfied that the scene was sufficient for his demonstration. Although he did lie slightly, his pistol was usually more powerful than the disruptor pistols. But still, the farmers did not need to know that. Remember, that was just the hand weapons that you will be up against. He began to walk back to the flyer, ignoring Kirk's ugly look, and continued his lecture. As I have been trying to tell your council, neither empire need come down with troops, but can attack you from space. Savage motioned for the group to get behind their vehicles. Once you are all safely behind your flyers, I will prove my point. Those that were trying to get a last look at the tractor increased their walk to a sprint and crouched behind their flyers. All of you get down and close your eyes. The men did as told, as Savage spoke again, seemingly to the flyer. Okay, Shaki, send one down at the target coordinates. At first, nothing happened. Then a sound like that of a high wind through the canyons could be heard, getting louder and closer. Savage reminded everyone to keep down and close their eyes. As he got the rest of the remainder out, the whistling sound turned into a large thunder crack. The ground suddenly trembled with enough force to knock some of the men down, as a photon torpedo hit the silo with a deafening roar. Bits of rock and wood erupted into the air amidst a yellow dust cloud which whipped around the flyers as the heat wave passed through. The after effects caused some of the men to yell out in terror. Finally, the detonation sound faded, and the fallout of dust slowly settled. It was then that the men were able to stand up and view the destruction that the torpedo had caused. Where the silo had once been was now a crater of blackened ground, 10 meters deep and 20 meters out. And nearest the crater was now a slick, sooty yellow glass, the grains of sand being fused by the tremendous heat. That was a single photon torpedo, the preferred weapon of both fleets for orbital bombardment, Savage informed him as he dusted himself off. But they can just as easily use their ship's disruptor banks. Some of the Romulan ships that may come also have a plasma bolt that, if fired at the center of Whiteless, would completely vaporize not only the entire city, but everything around it for a quarter mile. Kirk did not approve of the display that he had just seen, but he knew full well what Savage had just said was true. Now, what you face, Savage continued, as though he were teaching a class back at the academy, from the Romulans is a possible orbital bombardment outside of inhabited areas as a show of force before they beam down with troops. If they do not get what they want, the troops will begin a very methodical and destructive pattern through the city until they do. Savage paused to let the men talk among themselves for a moment before continuing. The Klingons, on the other hand, will probably beam down troops to find out exactly what is going on around here, most likely by torture. Once they find out about the Acolyte, they will not waste time with discussion or issuing demands. They will simply take and destroy. That brought some loud talk among the assembled group. The Savage quieted them down and continued. The Romulans will go when they get the crystals and leave it at that. But the Klingons, he shook his head, They may just decide to make this one of their colonies, or just reduce the area to ash for the fun of it, and to show what happens to those that resist their needs. Savage looked at the now vastly concerned group, their looks of smug defiance all but a faint memory. Now, I am not saying any of you are cowards, nor am I advising you to fight or not to fight. It is your world and your lives. I just believe that all of you deserve to know exactly what you are up against. Kenton called the group over to him to continue the discussion privately. Savage and the Enterprise officers walked away from the group a few meters. "Impressive display, Captain Savage," McCoy said sarcastically. "Nothing like scaring some poor farmers with advanced weaponry." "And just what do you think the Romulans or Klingons will do to these poor farmers?" Savage snapped harshly. "At least this may save some lives. It certainly didn't take any." McCoy turned away slightly. True, the display may scare some of the people enough that they wouldn't fight. Still, he didn't like the overt show of force. Khan had done that, showing what the abuse of such power can lead to. Savage looked down at the ground and kicked one of the blackened rocks from the silo explosion, then looked up at the yellowy sky. "The Aelia will be in orbit in 5 minutes," he said. They did not detect the Enterprise, but did pick up the torpedo detonation. "Commander Sater is wanting to meet with me." Kirk looked at Savage with a neutral face. He was still unsure how to feel about the demonstration, but what was done was done. "Where will you meet with him?" "The best place would be at Kenton's home, and go ahead and get all the overtures done with." He then turned his head slightly as if puzzled. "Shaki, repeat that, please. He told you to go on alert? Why?" Kirk looked at Spock and McCoy with a sudden worried look. Savage had been right. Having him talk to no one they could see or hear was somewhat disturbing. Savage turned to look at the group with a stone face. "The Klingons are on their way. Estimate 3 to 4 hours before they arrive. They are armed for bear. 3 cruisers and support ships. Sater has called in the Romulan fleet." "Damn," Kirk explained, hitting his fist in the palm of his hand. The trigger hadn't even been pulled, but the hammer was about to fall. He looked at Savage and gave a nod. "Get the Ravager to relay a message to the Enterprise. Tell them to send for the cavalry." Chapter 8. "Would you please sit down, Hal?" Kenton told Ralter in a stern voice. He had grown tired of Ralter's continual nervous pacing in the living room of his home. Ralter stopped and looked at Kenton. "How can you sit there so calmly? Any of you," he added with a wavering voice as he looked at the others. Spock looked at him with his calm, unemotional face and spoke. "Mr. Ralter, it is illogical to worry over events that have yet to happen, or events that you cannot change." McCoy shook his head in an agitated agreement. "It's not going to do any good to just walk around. Besides, you're getting on my nerves." Ralter nodded and conceded. "It's just that our choice of fighting them, especially after that show that Captain Savage put on, has me bothered." He carefully sat next to the window, as if such an action would alert someone to his presence. He looked out toward the green fields and the yellow-brown mountains beyond. "I mean, yes, we are fighting for our world, which is worth fighting for. It just seems that there must be another way. If we had more time, Mr. Ralter, perhaps. But," Kirk said, "it's too late for that now. We have to play the cards that we are dealt." Savage had been setting off to himself, staying out of the conversation, but he now rose up and strode toward the door. "He's here." Ralter looked out the window nervously. "I don't send anyone out there." Savage continued out the door. "You will." Kirk motioned for the others to follow as Kenton walked behind the assured form of Savage to stand on the porch. Kenton stood to Savage's left, while Kirk and the others to his right. Ralter stayed in the house, glancing outside from the edge of the window. Savage glanced to his right slightly to look at the Starfleet officers. "Doctor, Captain Spock, I suggest that you two stand a little farther apart and make sure that your hands are in sight. We don't want anyone thinking this is an ambush. It might lead to a regrettable situation." The two did as requested, as the sound of the Romulan transporter began to grow. The green shimmering effect of matter being reorganized from energy formed into 6 individual shapes before them. The form solidified into Commander Sator and 5 Centaurians. At the sight of the Federation uniforms, the Centaurians drew their pistols, while Sator's hand moved to rest on the grip of his own weapon. He then recognized Savage and signaled the Centaurians to holster the weapons as he walked toward the group, Garnon being the only Centaurian allowed to follow. Commander Sator looked at Kirk and glared, then at Spock. His hand began to move back to the grip of his pistol, Garnon following suit. Savage stepped down to stand between the 2 Romulans and Federation men. "Calm down, Commander Tavis," Savage spoke in a low, even voice. "They're not here for you to get back your honor." Sator hesitated, but looked at Savage. Savage nodded to the pistol, causing Sator to relax and bring his hand back to its normal position. He nodded for Garnon to do the same. "Very well, Captain Savage," he replied coldly. "I will settle this at a later date." The Romulan commander did not like being called Commander Tavis. It was an insult that very few non-Romulans knew about, and was a bit from Romulan history that Sator had once told Savage. Tavis had been a Romulan commander, and in command of a fleet of 5 ships. After learning of the death of his brother at the hands of a Klingon fleet, he ignored all orders and led his fleet into battle to get back his family honor. But the battle soon showed itself to be a trap set by the Klingons, the thirst for regaining honor blinding Tavis to the fact. The result of the battle was the loss of all Romulan ships and over 800 Romulan troops, including Commander Tavis. There were no Klingon losses. Since then, anyone who put personal honor over their duty to the Empire was referred to as Commander Tavis. Kenton stepped forward, following Savage's lead to defuse the situation. "Why are you back so early, Commander Sator? I was led to believe that we had more time to give you our final decision." The commander moved his gaze to Kenton. "My fleet commander has instructed me to come back at this time and get your answer. We grow tired of waiting, Kenton." He eyed Kirk and the other 2 again. "But perhaps what is more important at this time is why these Federation officers are here." Kirk stepped forward slowly, making sure that he did not make any sudden moves. The Centaurian next to the commander, along with the other 4, watched him very carefully. "We were asked to come here and try to settle this dispute peacefully." He studied Sator's face. Although it had been a long time, he could see the slight family resemblance between the female Romulan commander and Sator. "Then as Federation representatives, are you prepared to defend this planet should we attack?" Kirk knew that Commander Savage would know the answer to that question before he replied. "I hope that we can solve this problem without having to find out, Commander." Sator smirked, just as he had expected from the Federation. He looked at Savage. "And why are you here, Captain Savage?" "Oh, I'm just a neutral observer here," he responded innocently. "Quite actually, I was wanting to see if there was anything of interest on this planet. There may be a chance to make some credits here." "And having your ship fire a photon torpedo to the surface was part of this profit-making plan of yours?" he asked. Savage shrugged, but gave no other response. The Romulan half raised an eyebrow. "Not trying to sell weapons, are you?" "You know better than that, Commander," Savage replied, giving a quick glance at Kirk. I wouldn't want to violate any neutral zone policies, he finished with a smile. Sator smiled slightly in return and accepted Savage's reasons. He looked back at Kenton, his smile fading to a serious grim frown. And what is your response, Kenton? Kenton looked at Kirk, then back at Sator. As I have already told you, Commander, if you were to wait until the crystal growth period, we would gladly sell them to you. For now, I must still refuse to let you mine them. To do so now would disrupt their cycle, endangering their future production and my planet's culture. The commander nodded. As I expected. Know this, though. There are several Klingon ships on their way here at this very moment. They will most likely want the crystals as well, but instead of offering to pay you for it, they will burn your fields, destroy your cities, and kill your people. Think on that for a time. My empire has offered you a reasonable price, yet you still refuse us. Sator stepped back a moment, looking toward the distant peaks. Now we are forced to take what we want. But unlike the Klingons, he turned back to Kenton, we will not destroy you. The commander narrowed his eyes and looked at Kirk. Or anyone else, unless you try to stop us. Kirk gave a slight nod to show that he clearly understood the warning that Sator had given. Sator motioned to the sky. In a few hours there will be a grand battle in the stars, and when we emerge victorious, our troops will beam down to take the Acherite. They will not be in a mood to settle any arguments peacefully, no matter who is doing the arguing. Again he looked at Kirk. Seeing that the Federation captain was in full understanding on that point, Sator once again looked at Kenton. If you decide to change your mind, and I suggest you don't take too long to do so, contact me. Once the battle is done, I may not be on so friendly terms. He walked back to where he had beamed down. And I suggest to all of you, unless you want to risk getting in our way, leave. Savage stepped forward. Commander, if I may have a word with you in private. Sator raised an eyebrow, but nodded, walking over to where Kenton had parked his flyer. What is it, Captain? Savage frowned as he spoke lowly. Knock off the Romulan Commander Act here, Sator. You know as well as I do that we are looking at a reactor that's about to go critical. Having the Klingons come in is bad enough, but you know full well that the Federation isn't going to stand by and let you toast some helpless farmers that are fighting to defend their planet. Sator nodded. I know all of this, but it is out of my hands now. I had hoped that you would not be involved in this, but you are. I must warn you, Commander Darthos has made it clear that if you or anyone tries to stop us, he will not hesitate to open fire. Darthos? Savage said with a frustrated headshake. Just what is so important about these Acherite crystals that the Empire is willing to go for war with both the Klingons and the Federation? You know that I cannot say. My duty. Savage cut in. Your empire won't be around if this breaks into a war between either group. I am asking you as your friend and brother, what is going on? What you tell me will go no farther. Commander Sator looked into Savage's eyes as if trying to make a decision. Savage spoke calmly. You have my word of honor on that, Vaughn. Sator perked up with hearing his clan name spoken by the man in front of him. After a deep breath, he spoke deeply. I knew that when you asked. You have heard about the deaths taking place in the Empire? Savage nodded. A plague of some sort? No, he responded. We have only recently discovered the cause. The warp drive in our starships is causing a radiation field to form during the warp envelope. The envelope magnifies and reflects the radiation back onto the ship. At first, we did not believe that this was harmful to us. In fact, the actual exposure is not, unless it occurs continually over a very long period of time. How long? Savage asked, concerned, though he knew that he was probably only hearing half of the story. We do not yet know, but the damage that occurs does not immediately show. The radiation affects the DNA replication process of all the body cells. This damage does not greatly affect the individual, if at all, but it causes abnormalities in the genetic coding sequences of the gametes. He paused a moment, seeing if Savage comprehended what he said. As such, the effect is passed down to the offspring of those so damaged. The genetic damage may not show for a few generations, but when it does, the offspring are born dead or deformed. Some apparently normal offspring have only shown their genetic faults when exposed to the high radiation levels or continual warp energies. Sator frowned in grief as he continued. Quarren was one such individual. When exposed to radiation, the brain cells undergo adverse reactions, resulting in seizures, various degrees of brain damage, coma, and death, all without any prior knowledge or detection. Savage nodded in sympathy. Although he had not personally met Quarren, he knew who he was, and that he and Sator had been close friends. All of the deaths caused by space travel at warp speed was difficult to believe. The ramifications of this information was staggering. So, these crystals will stop the radiation damage. Yes, they are very conductive to electromagnetic radiation, and will not cause the leakage of energy that our current focusing crystals have. Without the crystals, we would have to build new reactor cores, or increase the shielding to all areas of the ships. He then thought of another factor to add to the problem. We may even have to develop a new propulsion system. Without warp speeds, the Romulan Empire will die. Savage walked around to Sator's side, still suspicious of the answer he was getting. These crystals are to be used in the engine core, and not any other systems? Sator furrowed his brow in secret dread. What do you mean? We have known each other for a long time, Vaughn, Savage said lowly. Some good, others not. But through all of that, you have never lied to me, nor I to you, at least when it came to a direct question of honor between us. The Romulan's facial muscles tightened, but Sator showed no emotion to the accusation. Are you saying that I'm lying to you? Not fully, but I know that these crystals also have extremely good optical qualities, and when used as a focusing crystal and a certain piece of equipment other than the reactor, it causes a certain effect to be some 40% more efficient in power utilization and 35% less detectable. It will also reduce your radiation leakage by 80%, depending upon the age and type of device it's used in. In addition, with that 40% more efficiency in power, you would be able to divert ship's power to, let's say, operate another high-power system that normally you can't under cloak. Savage narrowed his eyes. I'm asking you, as your brother, to tell me the truth so that I might prevent what this will lead to. Sator smiled inwardly. Savage knew the truth then. It always took Sator by surprise to find that this human was far more intelligent than any other person he had met. The commander gave a nod of concession, but also of futility before speaking. I can only answer, honorably, that as my brother, you accept what I have told you as the truth. Savage looked at him hard, causing Sator to avert his eyes and lower his head slightly. Very well, Vaughn, Savage agreed. I shall. Tell me one more thing. Sator looked up. Yes. Is the damage permanent? Sator shook his head and said lowly, We don't know for sure. Information on the phenomena is slow in coming. The only other thing that I know is that the problem does seem to be more pronounced in the offspring of the women that were exposed than that of the male. The commander paused and reached up to lay a hand on Savage's shoulder with concern. He gazed into the dark eyes to answer the question that the human feared to ask. She hasn't been in the service that long, Jen. I'm sure that any damage she may have received is very slight and not permanent. As far as her own health, you know as well that even though her father had been in the fleet, he conceived her before he had served many years. Savage slowly nodded with some relief at the news. What about you and the others? Unknown. As I said, the damage has, so far, been impossible to detect until it's too late. Again he looked into the dark eyes of Savage. We do know that it affects only those with a copper-based blood. Our electrolytes are more sensitive to the radiation, which means that your people are safe. Sator smirked somewhat. Unfortunately, so are the Klingons. Savage laughed slightly, walking back towards the Centaurians. He continued to speak lowly as Sator followed by his side. I am your friend and your brother. That means a great deal to me. He drew in a deep breath. I may not be able to support you in this, but I won't oppose you with force. Sator stopped, causing Savage to follow suit. I know that you mean that, Jen, and I feel the same way. Just keep clear of the area and the two of us can drink some ale after this is over. I don't know about staying clear, but we can discuss that after the Klingons are dealt with. He smirked as they continued to walk toward the Centaurians and the watchful eyes of Garnon. Besides, I would have thought that due to our position, you would rather have some Fralasia instead of that tasteless blue water of yours. Sator gave Savage an ugly look at first, smiled, and then laughed. I've had better swamp water. The smile disappeared quickly as the commander saw the Federation officers again. He let out a breath before adding quietly to Savage again. Seriously, Jen, the Klingon fleet is well armed. We cloaked when we picked them up at the edge of our scan, but we could tell that it's a good-sized fleet. I'm afraid that it's a little more than even the two of us can handle. Savage glanced at Kirk. Well, I just might be able to do something about that. You didn't pick up who was their fleet commander, did you? I did not need to. There is only one Klingon commander in the area that can lead a fleet of that size. Core, Savage said coldly. Sator nodded. I must beam back to the Aelia and communicate with Darthos. Even at top speed, our fleet will be here 2 hours after the Klingons arrive. We have that long to hold them off, or wait somewhere for my support fleet to arrive. Savage merely nodded. Contact me when you get your orders. If you are to stay and fight, the Ravager will stand beside you. The commander smiled at the offer. Until we meet again, then. Sator raised his hand up, palm aside facing Savage. The human returned the personal salute before Sator was joined by the Centaurians. The transporter took them away as Savage walked back to the group on the porch. What did the commander have to say, Captain Savage? Savage looked at Kenton. He said that there's a valiant flea that dares eat his breakfast on the lip of a lion. And what does that mean? Kenton questioned. It means, Mr. Kenton, that the Klingons will be here for 2 hours before the Romulan fleet arrives. You will have that long to deal with them before they are recalled to fight the Romulans. After that, you have however long it takes for a victor to emerge before you get tossed back into the battle. Savage then looked at Kirk. And we have that long for Starfleet to figure out if they want us in or out of the picture. Kirk grimaced. I'll contact Commodore Peterson again when we beam up. Kirk then gave an expectant look at Savage. What about the Acherite? Why do the Romulans want it so bad? It has to do with their engine core, Savage answered with a straight face. I'll explain later. He looked back at Kenton. You'd best get your men ready. Kenton nodded and shook each man's hand. At least you have let us get ready. We will do our best to defend ourselves, if you will just keep us up to date on what happens up there in space. Kirk smiled slightly. Of that you can be sure. Savage nodded in agreement. Savage to Ravager, forward to beam up. Kenton watched the forward vanish into energy. He turned to see a nervous Ralter peering out from behind the door. Come on, Hal. Let's get things ready for our welcoming party. The four men shimmered into existence on the transporter pads of the Ravager. Though smaller than the transporter room on the Enterprise, the general layout for the equipment was basically the same. Savage stepped down to the console and greeted the transporter chief that stood by. As far as Kirk could tell, the officer was in her mid-40s and dressed in the same red jumpsuit that Shahan had worn. Kirk could not tell, but it seemed that she did not have the symbolic dagger as the other Ravager crew had. She did have a holstered pistol, though. Apparently, the gun was a standard part of the duty uniform. Kelly, get the Enterprise online, please, Savage asked as he walked to the small view screen in the corner. Kirk and the other two moved over to the corner to stand by Savage. Captain Kirk, due to the curvature of the planet and the magnetic interference, we cannot beam you to your ship at its present location. Kirk frowned. You want me to order the ship to move down here and let Sator know that she's here? Savage looked at Kirk as though he had missed the simplest of problems. Even if I could beam you there from here, Sator would still pick it up and find your ship. There's no danger to the Enterprise as long as she doesn't take any provocative action. Right now, Sator needs the Enterprise, and you will need him. Commander Phelps online, sir, the transporter officer informed him. Thank you, Kelly. Prepare to get the Alia online as well. Savage turned to Kirk. Captain. Kirk stepped over to face Phelps on the small view screen. Commander Phelps, move the ship to an equilateral orbit over our current position. Keep shields and weapons powered down. There's a Romulan scout ship down here, and we don't want to make them nervous. Phelps looked at Kirk for a moment before he replied, Aye, sir. Savage glanced at the woman. Get Sator online. She nodded. Commander Sator, already standing by. Savage smiled a thank you, giving a slight nod to switch the channel open. Savage to Sator, come in. The Romulan appeared on the screen with a puzzled look. Sator here, Captain. I have yet to contact my fleet commander, if that's why you have called. Not really, Commander. In a few moments your sensors will detect a Federation cruiser coming down from the North Polar region. She is unarmed and has her shields down. He paused. So don't get trigger heavy over there. She's here to help. So that was your ace up the sleeve, Sator said with a knowing smile of realization. But Kirk was in command of the Enterprise, wasn't he? I had been informed it had been taken out of service, decommissioned. Surely this ship isn't it. Actually, yes, Savage answered. The Enterprise was given a chance for some more glory, like her captain. The Romulan frowned slightly at the news. And just how did you manage to make a ship that size go undetected from my ship's scan? Savage smiled. If you need to ask, maybe I should send Shaki over there to take command. A short laugh came over the speaker. Very well then, Savage. I will call you after I have made contact. Sator out. The screen went dark as Savage turned to face Kirk. I don't know what you expect me to do with the Enterprise, Captain Savage, Kirk began with a slight threatening tone. You know my orders prevent me from taking any action. Except in self-defense, I believe you said. That's right, Kirk answered with a nod. And if I take the ship away from the area, I won't have to worry about being put in such a position. Yes, well, I don't know all about that, Captain. Spock tilted his head slightly in puzzlement at such a remark. He looked at Savage. What do you mean by that, Captain? The man smirked slightly, and returned Spock's gaze, and glanced at Kirk. I am sure that you are quite familiar with the Klingon that is in command of the approaching fleet, Savage answered. Kor. Kor? Kirk questioned loudly. Kor? Isn't he the one? McCoy asked. Kirk nodded at McCoy for a moment, then remembered that he had not been with them on the landing party so many years ago. When Spock and I beamed down to Organia, he said, he was the Klingon commander of the task force that came in. McCoy nodded at the reply, but he still had no real idea of what importance Kor was to Kirk and Spock. The very same, Captain, Savage added, and he knows that you are in the area. If there's anyone that Kor would rather get his hands on, other than me, it's you. For you to be safe from him, I'm afraid that you would have to go back to Federation space. As long as you are in the Triangle, he'll leave Ganeth alone just to get you. Kirk agreed with a nod. It had been a long time since he had seen one of the Klingon-human fusions, or at least that's what Starfleet called them. It was still uncertain if they were another race of Klingon or some genetic altered group. They had been very populous on the border between the Empire and the Federation when he first commanded a starship. But then the Klingon Imperial race began to resent the power that the fusions were amassing. It wasn't long before the fusion races began to decline, for more reasons than one. Only the more powerful and influential of the fusions remained. Strange, he hadn't really thought about any of the fusions for some time. Then he thought about the ones he had met over the years. Kor, Kang, Koloth, and a few others. I guess bad thoughts do disappear over time, Kirk said to himself. He agreed with Savage's assessment of Kor. He would hunt down Kirk, with the same insane obsession that Khan Singh had. I had best get over to my ship and apprise Peterson of these developments. As you wish, Captain, Savage responded. I'm only sorry that we don't have time for a tour of the Ravager. Kirk smiled. Another time, Captain, but I appreciate the offer. Sir, Kelly called. Enterprise now in transporter range. Kirk looked from the chief to Savage and extended a hand. I may not agree with everything that you've done, but I am glad that you are here for whatever occurs. Savage took the hand with a sly smile. Don't be glad yet, Captain Kirk. As I have said before, you haven't gotten my bill yet. But I feel the same. Good luck, Captain. The three officers walked to the transporter pad. As their atoms were reduced to energy and sent over to the Enterprise, Savage walked out of the room to the bridge. Now, all that could be done was to wait. The wait wasn't long. Commander Sator had been ordered to remain at Ganeth and stand off the Klingon fleet for as long as possible. The Romulan fleet had increased speed to maximum and was now an hour ahead of schedule, ready for battle. Commodore Peterson had finally received news from Starfleet that would give Kirk permission to defend Ganeth from hostile forces, but he could not supply the people of Ganeth with any Federation technology in the form of phasers or other weaponry. The Federation fleet, led by Captain Sulu on the Excelsior, would be in range of Ganeth 2 in another hour and 20 minutes. That was 20 minutes behind the Romulan fleet. Kirk had decided to call a meeting with Savage to discuss their options. He had, reluctantly, and not without argument, agreed to have Commander Sator join them on board the Enterprise. Captain J.F. Savage materialized on the transporter pad, wearing his pirate uniform, as Kirk had called it, but minus the cape. He was greeted by Commander Phelps as he stepped down from the pad to await the arrival of Commander Sator. In moments the pad lit up again, and to Phelps' surprise, the Romulan commander appeared alone. Sator stepped down, ignoring the two armored security officers that stood to either side of the door. He walked over to Savage, who introduced him to Phelps. After a brief greeting, the three strode out into the corridor, the two security guards behind them. Commander Phelps led the way down the empty corridors as Sator whispered over to Savage. "It's a good thing that I didn't bring any of my Centaurians. I think they may have scared these turtle guards to death." Savage muffled a laugh. Turtle guard was a common insult in the Triangle in reference to the armored Federation security guards. The brown ceramic duralloy construction that they wore provided excellent protection from melee weapons and low-velocity projectile weapons, even decent protection from long-range energy fire or glancing hits. At close range, however, the armor did little to protect the wearer from a high phaser or disruptor setting. His own blaster pistol would have burned a hole in the front plates, dispersing rapidly through the armor layers to exit the back in a meter-wide area, taking all the tissue in between with it. In other words, the guard would be completely dead. "Commander Phelps," Savage asked in a lightly gruff tone, "are these two guards going to follow us all over the ship?" "Yes, sir," Phelps answered simply. "Captain Kirk's orders." "My," Sator started in a mocking tone, "I did not know that you were such a dangerous man, Captain Savage." Savage smiled at the remark. "Well, you know how rumor spreads." Inwardly, Savage doubted that Sator would be in such a humorous mood had he known that Savage had been aboard before now. He quickly wondered about the guards. Were they simply for show and helping to lend to his shadowy character, or did Kirk actually feel the need for security on one Romulan commander? Phelps tried to ignore the conversation between the two following him. Commander Sator seemed wholly unconcerned about the security guards or the chances of being thrown into the brig. In fact, it seemed to Phelps that the Romulan was thoroughly enjoying the honor of being considered such a possible threat as to require guards. The group soon reached the briefing room to be greeted by Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Two additional men that Sator had not met were introduced as engineers, Scott and Maxwell. Sator laughed to himself when he saw the look on Maxwell's face, but secretly took note of why Federation vessels seemed to fare so well in battle. What other race would spend the extra resource of personnel to have two engineers aboard the same vessel? The Romulan looked at Kirk with a sly smile. "Nice ship you have, Captain Kirk. I don't suppose we have time for a tour?" Kirk did not quite stammer, but was somewhat confused by the apparent humorous mood of the Romulan. Such was the last thing he expected from a Romulan commander, especially in this situation. Kirk returned a polite smile, however. "I'm sorry, Commander, but we don't." The commander nodded with disappointment as he sat down. "Ah, well, perhaps later, when we are finished with our various missions." Kirk gave a slight smirk and motioned for the guards to leave. Savage sat down next to Sator as Kirk spoke. "Commander Sator, I agree to have you here because we will be facing a common foe. We have been given permission to defend the planet from the Klingon invasion force. Since you appear to have been ordered to do the same, and Captain Savage has decided to remain as well, I thought the three of us may want to meet and discuss some coordinated plans for our three ships." "I thought as much, Captain Kirk. My fleet commander is in agreement that we should join forces and hold off the Klingons, but also warns that after the battle, if you should try to interfere with our plans for Ganeth, you will then be facing Romulan guns." "Let's just deal with one thing at a time," Savage cut in. "For the first hour or so, when the Klingons get here, it will only be the three of us against them. After that, we can count on assistance from both the Federation and Romulan fleets that are on their way." That drew stern looks from both Kirk and Sator. Savage gave a slight shrug. "Gentlemen, this is a high-stakes game here, and if we don't throw all of the cards on the table, we may as well not play. We need to inform both fleets that the common foe here are the Klingons. If we don't, both fleets may do to each other what the Klingons wish they could do. Logical, Sator said at the same time that Spock also spoke. The Romulan looked at Spock as though he was preparing to say the worst insult possible, but decided not to do so. He looked back at Savage, then at Kirk. I agree. I shall contact my fleet after this meeting. Until then, we must discuss our joint plans. Kirk nodded in agreement. Having Sulu in charge of the fleet would make it easy to coordinate information and not worry about weapon-happy captains. Neither Sulu nor Chekhov would be the ones to fire first, unless they were forced to do so. Captain Kirk, Sator continued, I know fairly well what the Ravager is capable of in battle, but I do not know much about your ship. I realize that you would not want to provide much information regarding this, and I fully understand. However, during our tactical discussion, if your ship is better suited or not for a certain function, please say so. Agreed, Commander Sator, Kirk responded. The most distinct disadvantage of the Enterprise over your two ships is the lack of a cloaking device. We could use that to our advantage, however. Captain Savage and I, Sator smiled slightly, giving a brief nod to the human sitting beside him, have often used a tactic where one ship remains visible to draw the enemy in, then the other ship decloaks, making a surprise attack. Kirk thought a second. Such a tactic could work. But if Kor knows that Captain Savage is here too, would he not expect something like that? Captain Savage looked at Sator with a sly smile, then at Kirk. I would hope so. Kirk wasn't the only one confused. Why so, Captain? Phelps asked. Sator wore a twin smile of Savage as he answered Phelps' question. Because, Commander, when Ravager decloaks and fires, Kor won't even think about another cloaked ship coming into the battle, especially not a Romulan ship. We could put the Enterprise back into the polar orbit and use it as a surprise, Scott suggested. He reflected the concern of letting his ship be used as a setting duck, remembering back to Commander Chang and his prototype bird of prey that was blasting away at his poor lass. That probably would not work here, Sator advised with a shake of his head. A fleet that size would most likely not be taken in by that trick, as a single ship would be. He cast a look at Savage momentarily. The Romulan continued his assessment. With the suspicion that a cloaked ship may be in the area, Kirk will have his fleet spread out, and at least two of them on short-range scan, and possibly visual. Further, if no ship is present, when he knows that there should be at least one, he will have his ship scan the area intensely, which would detect your ship. Your plan may work if I left the Alia in orbit, but I would require a fast backup. Regardless of our tactic, we'll still be outnumbered, won't we? McCoy asked slowly. Yes, Savage admitted. From what Sator was able to pick up on the Klingon battle fleet, there are 3 Katinga cruisers, one of which is Kor's flagship, 2 Klingon bird of prey scouts, and a K-27 escort. Savage frowned. However, Kor has the ability to call in one of their great bird frigates, plus its support ships. He nodded at Sator. The 2 of us can easily handle the scouts and the escort, but the cruisers would be a problem unless we can take them on one at a time. It would be logical then, and to our advantage, the Vulcan spoke in a monotone voice, to break up the Klingon fleet instead of attempting to take on the entire fleet. Savage agreed with Spock, thinking for a moment. He turned to Savage. Running bird? It may work, the Romulan replied, thinking out loud. Especially if this ship is the bird. Kirk and the others were confused. Running bird? He questioned, disliking the idea of using tactics that he was unfamiliar with. Yes, Captain. It's a strategy that the two of us have used many times, Savage explained. One ship positions itself at a specific location and cloaks. The second ship remains visible and leads the opponent toward the location of the first ship, which then decloaks and fires as they pass by. In this case, Sater picked up, our two ships would be positioned somewhere in the system and cloak. Your ship remains in orbit of Ganeth until the Klingon fleet reaches center range. At that time, you will leave orbit and lead them to us. Savage continued explaining the well-known joint plan. Kor will not want to leave the place totally alone, and will probably drop his support ships and follow only with the three cruisers. Once they come in range, we decloak to fire on their aft, while you fire on their fore side. Kirk quickly picked up the mutual symbiosis of the two captains. They planned quickly together and in concert, one not trying to outdo the other. Kirk then remembered the last words spoken by the first Romulan commander that he had met before he destroyed his own vessel. I regret that we meet in this way. You and I are of a kind. In a different reality, I might have called you friend. Kirk studied the two ship commanders, thinking and planning together before him. One human, one Romulan. This was proof of what that commander had said. But despite the working relationship between the two, the Federation captain still did not like the idea of using his ship as a sitting duck. But he gave in. This tactic had its merits. Are you sure they'll fall for it? Phelps asked, sharing the same unspoken feelings as Kirk. Knowing Kor the way I do, yes, Savage answered. I know he definitely will if Captain Kirk invites him to do so. Just tell Kor that he can have the planet if he wants it. Spock raised an eyebrow. Is that not what we are attempting to prevent? We cannot prevent planet takeover at our present strength, Commander Sater matter-of-factly informed the group. But we can thin out the fleet enough and be able to return to the planet to deal with those that are left here. Kirk made a grim face, not hiding his concern about the matter. I would prefer some other tactic, but this one sounds like it will work. If we head for the incoming Federation fleet, they'll be just that much sooner that they'll be able to in a position to help. Realizing that a decision had been made, the non-Federation officers stood up. We'll begin as soon as you're ready, Captain Kirk, Savage told him, offering a hand. Kirk gripped Savage's hand in response. We'll be ready in a few minutes. Sater nodded, but said nothing. He gave Kirk and Spock one last look of lingering desire for revenge before heading for the door, followed by Savage. Captain Savage, Kirk called. A moment, please. Savage turned to look at Kirk with a puzzled expression, then gave a nod to Sater. I will meet you in the transporter room. Sater nodded and continued on. Savage stepped back in the room, waiting for the doors to slide shut before responding. Yes, Captain. Can we trust him? Kirk asked, motioning towards the closed door. Not fully in this instance, Savage responded. I know Sater too well. He will stand and fight with us, probably risking his ship in your defense, but only because, for right now, it will help put his goal that much closer. When there is a break in the battle, though, he'll break off and head back for Ganeth and get what he can. And he'll be there all by himself if the Klingons leave, McCoy complained. Savage shook his head. He won't have to worry about the Klingons for long, if at all. By the time he gets there, the Romulan fleet should be close enough to scare off the Klingons from Ganeth. Then he smiled slyly. As for being alone, once the Enterprise is safe from danger, I'll follow Sater wherever he goes, and he won't know it until he tries something tricky. Kirk half smiled, still not knowing what side Savage would eventually choose. Good luck then, again. Savage smirked. And again, this is one bill the Starfleet won't want to pay. I'll contact you two when we are in position. If you or I need to pass any confidential information, we use the two-band transmission." Savage turned again and headed out the door, but paused as it opened. He looked back at Kirk and smiled. "By the way, give my compliments to your communications officer. Not many people would pick up on those types of transmissions without the foreknowledge of what they were for." Kirk smiled with a nod as the doors closed. "But can we trust him?" McCoy asked, motioning towards the doors. "I hope so, Bones. If not, this will be a very short battle," Kirk replied.